Julian Calloway was 41 years old. A man who had spent the last 16 years building a private investment firm most of the people in his fiancée's circle had only ever heard him describe as something quiet he did with money. He wore a wool coat that night that he had bought at a thrift store for $19 3 days earlier. A pair of second-hand work pants and a knit cap pulled low over his eyes. His wallet held $40 in singles and a transit card. His phone had been left, by agreement, in a drawer at his fiancée's apartment on the morning of the first day. It was the 7th evening of 14. He had not shaved. He had not eaten a full meal in 2 days because the budget she had set for him would not allow it. On a Wednesday night in late November, he walked into a small diner on the east side of the city with $17 left to his name, sat down in a booth near the window, and ordered the cheapest item on the menu from a waitress who looked at his coat and at his hands and at the careful way he had counted his money on the counter, and decided, without saying anything to him about it, that his coffee that night was going to be on her. She had no idea that the woman who had sent him out into the cold 7 nights earlier had spent every one of those 7 nights doing something he would learn about, in documents, on the morning of the 15th day. Before we jump into the story, comment where in the world you are watching from, and subscribe, because tomorrow's story is one you need to hear. The diner that night was warm, in the way diners get warm in late November. The kind of warmth that holds the smell of coffee and bacon grease, and the rain off the coats of the people who had been on the bus before they came in. Julian sat in the booth near the window and put his hands flat on the laminate table to stop them from shaking, because his hands had been cold for 6 hours, and he had not yet decided whether the shaking was the cold or the hunger. The waitress was a quiet woman in her early 30s named Hannah Reeves. She wore a black apron over a dark sweater. She moved through the diner the way she moved through most things, carefully, without taking up more space than she needed. She brought him a small laminated menu. She set down a glass of water without asking. She told him to take his time. She did not, when she said it, look at his coat in the way the man at the register had looked at his coat when he came in. Julian ordered the soup. It was $3.75. He counted out the singles on the table and laid them flat. He told Hannah he would also take a coffee if it was not too much trouble. She wrote it on her pad. She did not say anything about the coffee. She walked back to the counter. She came back 4 minutes later with a bowl of soup that was larger than what he had ordered, a small basket of bread that he had not ordered, and a cup of coffee that did not appear on the check she set down beside it. She did not say anything about any of it. She refilled his water. She moved on to her next table. Julian Calloway had spent the last 16 years building Calloway Capital Partners, which had begun as a single small fund he had run out of a borrowed office at 25, and which now managed slightly over $4 billion across 3 asset classes. He owned 68% of the firm. He had taken it from a single fund to where it now sat without his name appearing in any of the regional business press, because he had asked his communications director, a woman named Patrice Lynn, to make certain it never did. Patrice had been with him for 13 years. She had been very good at her job. Most of the people at his fiancée's office, including the senior partners, knew Julian only as a quiet man in nice but unremarkable clothes who came to events occasionally and rarely stayed long. His fiancée preferred it that way. His fiancée was named Vanessa Holloran. She was 36 years old, a vice president at a public relations firm she had joined 4 years ago, and at which she had spent those 4 years explaining, to anyone who would listen, that she was a self-made woman who did not need a man's money to define her. She had been engaged to Julian for 14 months. The disguise had been her idea. It had started, by Julian's recollection, at a dinner in late September at a restaurant Vanessa had picked. She had been drinking. She had told him, halfway through the second course, that she sometimes worried about whether what they had was real. She had told him she had read an article that week about a woman who had married a wealthy man and had spent the rest of her life wondering whether he had ever truly loved her, or whether she had truly loved him, or whether either of them would have chosen the other if the money had not been in the room. She had told him she did not want to be that woman. She had told him she had been thinking, for a while now, that she wanted to do something to prove to both of them that what they had was real. Julian had asked her what she meant. She had told him. What she had meant was this. She had wanted him to spend 2 weeks living on the street. Not literally on the street, she had clarified quickly. He could rent a small room at a transient hotel in a part of the city he did not normally go to. He would not be allowed to use his real name, his real cards, his real phone, any of his contacts, or any of the businesses he ordinarily used. He would dress the part. He would carry only the money she gave him, which would be enough for the room and for food at the level a man in that situation would actually eat at. He would do this for 14 days. He would, during those 14 days, see how people treated him, and he would, by the end, know something about himself and about the world that he could not learn any other way. She had told him this was something she had been thinking about for months. She had told him she had been reading about it. She had told him she thought it would do something for them. Julian had been quiet for a long moment after she finished. He had asked her what she would be doing during those 14 days. She had said she would be at home. She had said she would be missing him. She had said she would be available to him at any hour by leaving a message at a number she would give him. She had said she would also be praying for him, in her own way, which was an expression he had heard her use perhaps 4 times in 3 years of dating and had never quite understood. He had not asked her to clarify. He had sat with her proposal for the rest of the dinner. He had told her, by the time the coffee came, that he would think about it. He had thought about it for 8 days. He had not been able to think of a good reason to say no that did not, when he tried to put it into words, also sound like the reason a man might give for not wanting to be tested. He had said yes on a Sunday morning at her kitchen counter while she was making coffee, and she had set down the cup she was holding, and had kissed him on the forehead, and had said she loved him for being the kind of man who would do this. They had begun 2 weeks later, on a Monday in mid-November. He had left his phone in the drawer of her nightstand. He had walked out of her apartment building with the wool coat and the second-hand pants and the $17 she had given him for the first day. And he had taken the bus across the city to the transient hotel she had picked out for him. And he had not contacted her, by the rules she had set, for what was supposed to be 14 days. That was the version of the agreement Julian had walked into. The version Vanessa had walked into was different. Julian did not know this on the night of the 7th day, sitting in Hannah Reeves's booth with a bowl of soup that was larger than what he had ordered. He would learn it on the morning of the 15th. What he knew on the night of the 7th was that he was cold, and that he was hungry, and that he had been treated very badly by approximately 20 people that week, and that he had been treated with small, ordinary kindness by approximately 3. Hannah Reeves had been the third. She had not been the most dramatic. The most dramatic had been a Vietnam veteran named Ray, who slept 4 blocks from the transient hotel and had, on the second night, when Julian had told him he was new to the area and did not know where to go for a meal, walked him 6 blocks in the rain to a soup kitchen and made sure he got in line before turning around and walking back. Ray had not asked Julian for anything. Ray had told him, on the way, that the world had 2 kinds of people and you found out which kind a person was by what they did when they had nothing to gain from doing it. Hannah, at the diner, was the kind Ray had described. Julian finished his soup. He drank his coffee. He counted out the $3.75 and a $1 tip, because that was what he had, and that was what he was going to leave, and he set the bill on the edge of the table. He thanked Hannah when she came back. She nodded. She said, "Stay warm out there." The wind picked up. She refilled his water glass before he stood up to leave, even though he was about to leave, because that was how she had been raised. He walked back to the transient hotel through the wind. He sat on the edge of the narrow bed in the small room. He did not sleep well. He had been thinking for most of the week about the woman he was going home to in 7 days. He had been thinking about it in a way he had not anticipated thinking about it. The disguise had been Vanessa's idea. It had been framed as something that would tell them whether what they had was real. He had been so focused, the first 3 days, on the gap between how people in nice clothes were treated and how people in his clothes were treated, that he had not yet asked himself the question Vanessa had told him the exercise was for. He had not asked himself whether he wanted to come home to her. By the 7th night, sitting on the edge of the narrow bed, he had begun to ask. 3 weeks before he walked out of Vanessa's apartment with a thrift store coat and $17, Patrice Lynn had come into Julian's office on a Thursday afternoon and had closed the door and had sat down across from him with a folder in her hands. Patrice did not bring folders into his office. Patrice handled folders through the calendar, through email, through her own staff. The folder in her hands meant something. Julian had asked her what was in it. Patrice had set it on the desk and had said, quietly, "Before you do this thing she has asked you to do, I want you to read this." What Patrice had brought him was a file his outside attorney, Walter Chen, had quietly developed over the previous 5 months. It had begun with a small irregularity Patrice had noticed in the summer when Vanessa had asked Julian, in passing, whether he could give her temporary access to one of the firm's secondary accounts for what she had described as a small bridge for a friend's project. Julian had said no, not because he had suspected anything, but because the firm's compliance structure did not permit personal use of any account by any non-employee. Vanessa had laughed and had said she had been kidding. Patrice had been in the next room. Patrice had not thought Vanessa had been kidding. Patrice had asked Walter to spend a few weeks looking at Vanessa's professional and financial footprint, very quietly, on Patrice's own personal authorization. Because Patrice had learned in 13 years of working for Julian that the only kind of question worth asking about the people closest to him was the kind you asked before you needed the answer. The file Patrice had brought to Julian's desk that Thursday contained the answer. Vanessa Halloran had been, for the previous 9 months, in a private financial arrangement with a man named Derek Mossman, who ran a small boutique investment firm in the city, and who had, until 2 years ago, been a junior analyst at one of Julian's competitors. Derek Mossman had been engaged to be married twice. He had broken both engagements. He was 38 years old, charming in the way men in his line of work were trained to be charming, and carrying approximately $140,000 in private debt that no bank knew about, owed across 3 private lenders to whom he had been making the minimum interest payments for the last 18 months. Vanessa had been seeing him since the previous February. Walter had photographs, dates, and a small but precise mapping of the financial choreography. Vanessa had not, as of the date of the file, taken any money from Julian directly. She had, however, used her engagement to him as social and reputational collateral with 2 of Derek's lenders, both of whom had agreed in writing to extend his repayment schedule on the understanding that a Callaway marriage was imminent. She had also begun, very quietly, to inquire of Julian's outside counsel about the structure of his prenuptial draft, the timeline on which the marital community property rules would attach in their state, and the specific tax instruments through which a spouse could be granted access to a closely held private partnership. Patrice had asked Walter to draft a single-page summary The summary had been clinical. Walter had not been speculating. Walter had been documenting. Julian had read the file in 20 minutes. He had not said anything for several minutes after he finished. He had then asked Patrice one question. Has she proposed the thing yet? Patrice had not asked him what he meant. Patrice had said, she has not. We expect her to within the next 4 weeks. Julian had said, why do we expect that? Patrice had said, because Derek Mossman has a payment due on the larger of his 2 private debts on the 18th of December. He cannot make it. He has been in contact with her about it 3 times in the last 10 days. Julian had been quiet for a long time. He had said, finally, if she asks me to do something unusual in the next 4 weeks, something that would put me out of contact, off my normal accounts, away from my normal people. Patrice had said, then we let her do it. And we watch what she does with the time. Julian had nodded slowly. He had said, all right. Vanessa had asked him at dinner in late September. He had given her the answer she had been expecting 8 days later. He had begun the 14-day period on a Monday in mid-November. He had not told her any of what he knew. He had walked out the door with the $17 she had given him, and he had let her have the 14 days. That was the version of the agreement he had walked into. He didn't move fast. That was what people who had only ever met Julian once never quite understood about him. If he had wanted fast, the file Patrice had handed him in late September could have been on Vanessa's kitchen counter by the 1st of October. He had not wanted fast. He had wanted to know what Vanessa would do with 14 days she believed he was not watching. He had wanted to give her every chance to do something other than what Patrice and Walter expected her to do. He had also wanted, although he had not articulated this to anyone, including himself, to spend 2 weeks in clothes that did not announce anything, in a part of the city he did not normally go to, and to find out who he was when no one had any reason to be nice to him. By the 7th day, he had begun to find out. He had also begun to find out, through Patrice's daily updates left in a sealed envelope at the front desk of the transient hotel, under a name Vanessa did not know, what Vanessa was doing with her own 7 days. She had done several things. On the morning of the first day, 11 minutes after Julian had walked out of her apartment, she had called Derek Mossman. On the morning of the second day, she had met with a junior officer at her bank to inquire about expediting the joint account application Julian had quietly authorized in October, and which had been sitting in the bank's queue waiting for one final signature, which she had attempted that morning to provide on his behalf using a notarization that Walter had been monitoring for the previous 6 weeks and had quietly arranged would not in fact clear. On the morning of the 4th day, she had hosted Derek at her apartment for what appeared to have been most of the afternoon. On the morning of the 6th day, she had been to a meeting with her own attorney, a man Patrice had identified months earlier as someone Vanessa had retained without telling Julian, and had begun the preliminary paperwork for a post-nuptial arrangement she intended to present to Julian on the 15th day, framed as her own gesture of trust, but which was structured in a way that would, by the 2nd year of marriage, transfer approximately 11% of Julian's voting stake in Callaway Capital Partners into a jointly held trust. Julian read the daily envelopes by the small lamp in the transient hotel room. He read them carefully. He did not act on any of them. He had agreed, on a Sunday morning at Patrice's kitchen counter, that he would let the 14 days run. He kept the agreement. On the morning of the 15th day, Julian walked out of the transient hotel at 6 in the morning, took the bus to the corner near his own home, walked the last 2 blocks, let himself in with the key he had not used in 14 days, showered, shaved, put on a suit, and drove to his office. Patrice was already there. Walter was already there. The 4 documents had been prepared. The end of the engagement had been drafted as a private letter, not as a public filing. Because nothing about Vanessa's behavior required a public filing. The disclosure to the 2 private lenders about the actual state of the imminent marriage had been drafted by Walter under a separate cover. The recall of the prenuptial draft Vanessa had been inquiring about had been issued the previous afternoon. The 4th document was a single-page note. Julian had asked Walter to prepare to Derek Mossman's outside counsel, informing him, in dry language, that Callaway Capital Partners had been made aware of the financial arrangements between Mr. Mossman and Miss Halloran, that the firm had no interest in pursuing Mr. Mossman directly, and that the firm had also no further interest in any social or reputational connection between any of the parties. The 4 documents were sent by 10 o'clock. Julian called Vanessa at 11. He told her he was home. He told her he had a great deal to tell her, and he believed she had a great deal to tell him, and he would like to do both of these things at his attorney's office at 2 in the afternoon. She had agreed before he finished the sentence. He could hear the relief she was trying to keep out of her voice, and mostly failing. She believed the 14 days had worked. She believed she was about to be told that she had been right about everything. She had no idea that the 4 documents she had not yet seen had been delivered to 4 different desks already that morning, and that 2 of those desks belonged to people on whom her plans for the next 6 months had been quietly resting. She arrived at Walter's office at 5 minutes after 2. Walter opened the meeting. He thanked her for coming. He said there were several matters that required acknowledgement before any further conversation could take place. He placed the first document on the table. It was the file Patrice and Walter had developed over the previous 5 months. He walked her through it. Dates, photographs, the 2 private lenders, the bank application from the 2nd day, the post-nuptial draft from the 6th. He did not raise his voice. He did not need to. Vanessa's face moved through several small adjustments. She did not look at Walter. She looked at Julian. She said, "Finally, how long have you known?" Julian looked at her. He had been waiting all morning for that question. He answered it the way he answered most things, plainly, since September. The silence in the room lasted 9 seconds. Julian counted them. He stood. He buttoned his jacket. He picked up the folder he had brought with him, which had stayed closed the entire meeting, because he had never needed to open it. He shook Walter's hand. He walked toward the door. He stopped with his hand on the doorframe. He turned halfway back. He spoke quietly, only for her, not as performance, because it was meant for her. "You asked me to spend 2 weeks proving I would love you without my name on me," he said. "You used those 2 weeks to spend something you had not earned and had not been given. You decided that the kind of man I was meant I would walk back through the door of that apartment, grateful enough to sign anything you put in front of me. You weren't wrong about the walking back through the door. You were wrong about what I would be carrying when I did. That was the part that cost you." He walked out without looking back. It did not happen all at once. By the end of the following week, Derek Mossman's 2 private lenders had withdrawn the extensions they had granted on the strength of the imminent marriage. By the end of the month, Derek had defaulted on the larger of the 2 notes. Vanessa was not named in any of the proceedings because she had not been a party to any of the loans. She had been a reputation. The reputation by Christmas had been quietly revoked. She left her firm in February, not because she was asked to, but because the people she had spent 4 years cultivating had begun, very quietly, to stop returning her calls. Julian did not pursue any of it. He had not needed to. Walter had handled the filings. Patrice had handled the disclosures. He spent December at the office. He spent January at the Lagos office, where Callaway Capital had taken a position in a regional infrastructure fund earlier in the year, and where the work was good and the days were full. He thought, several times that winter, about the small diner on the east side of the city. He thought about Hannah Reeves. He had walked past the diner twice in December. He had not gone in. He had not been sure what he would have said if he had. He had been sure only that what he had felt at her table on the seventh night had been the simplest, cleanest thing he had felt in 3 years, and that he did not want to bring his real life into her diner the way a man might bring it, with money and a name and a story she would not have asked for. In late February, Julian's foundation, which Patrice had been quietly expanding for 2 years, finalized a small grant program for working caregivers in the city. The program covered tuition, certification fees, and a 1-year stipend for adult learners pursuing nursing credentials. It was administered through 3 community partners. One of the partners, by Patrice's recommendation, was the community college on the east side of the city. Hannah Reeves applied for the program in March. She had been talking about nursing school for 6 years. She did not know who had funded the program. She had not heard the name Callaway. She had not, in any case, ever asked the man in the wool coat what his name was. The grant came through in May. Hannah began her coursework in September. She kept the job at the diner 2 evenings a week because she liked the people and because the tips, with the grant covering everything else, were now hers to save. On a Wednesday night in November, exactly 1 year after the night Julian had counted out the singles on her table, Julian sat in a small apartment he had quietly kept on the east side of the city for the previous 9 months. He was not in the diner. He had decided, several months earlier, that he was not going to walk into the diner. He had decided that the kindness Hannah had shown him on a night when she had nothing to gain from showing it was a thing that did not require him to do anything in return except not make it small. He sat at his kitchen window with a glass of water. The wind was up. He could hear it against the glass. He thought about Ray, the Vietnam veteran who had walked him to the soup kitchen on the second night, who had told him the world had 2 kinds of people. He thought about Hannah. He thought about the soup that had been larger than what he had ordered. He sat for a long time. Then, he went inside and turned out the light. I hope you enjoyed that one. Be sure to like the video and subscribe so you don't miss the next story. I've picked out 2 more for you that I think you'll really like.